speaker is Dr. Jinsy Andrews. She has a resume that illustrates why people with ALS seek her opinion on care and research opportunities. She completed her fellowship training in neuromuscular medicine under the mentorship of Dr. Hiroshi Matsumoto at Columbia. As a research fellow, she continued to participate in clinical research and care for patients with ALS at the Eleanor and Lou Gehrig ALS Center. She was the head of neuromuscular therapeutics at the drug company Cytotherapeutics. She is currently an assistant professor of neurology in the Division of Neuromuscular Medicine at Columbia University and serves as the director of neuromuscular clinical trials. A few years ago, she spoke at our chapter's research forum, and evaluations were excellent. She was very easy to understand, which is why she's speaking at our symposium today. Recently, she joined the Board of Trustees of the ALS Association and serves as vice chair of the research committee. And now, here's Jinsy Andrews.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jinsy Andrews, and I'd like to thank the ALS Association for the opportunity to participate in the virtual Help and Hope Symposium for May 2020. I'm going to talk about updates on ALS clinical trials, and it's a very big topic, and it'll cover multiple aspects of clinical trials. So these are my disclosures, and some of the compounds that I'll talk about involve them, and I'll call them out as I go. So in addition to just clinical trials, I want to just briefly cover therapeutic targets, and then of course go over the human clinical trials in ALS. From there, I'll also talk about clinical trials targeting gene mutations in ALS, as well as clinical trials using cell therapy. Of course, given the current situation in the US, I'd also talk about the impact of COVID-19 on ALS clinical trials at the moment, and then wrap up with pre-approval access pathways and mechanisms. So this is just one slide to give an overview of therapeutic targets. And in ALS, we've discovered many different mechanisms that are not working properly in the motor nerve that goes to the muscle. When the nerve isn't functioning properly, the muscle can't contract fully. That causes weakness. And as the nerve dies, the weakness ensues. And so many of these, I kind of view this as puzzle pieces. So we have a few scenarios where we've identified mitochondrial dysfunction or protein aggregation or impaired transport along the neuron. And these are pieces that we've kind of put together 2 or 3 at a time, but we don't have the big picture yet. And once we have that big picture, I think we'd come very close to figuring out the disease and curing it. So from there, I wanted to just give a brief overview of those therapeutic targets, because then I'll refer to them with each of these compounds that are in clinical trials. Now, when I talk about clinical trials in people, there are phases that span from phase 1 all the way to phase 4. So in phase 1, usually that's the study that's the first study in humans. So there's been a lot of evidence in animal models or in lab-based experiments. And after enough information is gathered, it is then moved into a human clinical trial. So that first one is a phase 1 study, primarily to evaluate safety and tolerability of that investigational drug. Once you've established some safety, you can then move to a phase 2 study where you're trying to optimize the ideal dose, as well as collect more safety and tolerability data and look at any signals for preliminary effect. If you see that effect, you then confirm it in a very large phase 3 study where you include a wider population, longer term dosing. And if you get that same effect, you can then file for approval with the FDA. Certainly there are drugs that get approved by the FDA, but then go on for further studies. And that's called a post-marketing study or phase 4. One example of a current phase 4 study is edaravone, also known as Radicava. There's a biomarker study where we're collecting markers of disease progression while people are taking edaravone or Radicava. Now, biomarkers, what does that mean? A biomarker is a measure of biological state or disease process. This is a very important aspect, and I think if there's any opportunity to participate in such a research study, it's really important to do so, because that's where we learn a lot about the disease and help us figure out targets and markers that we can measure for the disease. So biomarkers can be anything from imaging studies like MRIs to fluid collected from your body, the urine, blood, spinal fluid, or tissue like skin cells, or other types of biomarkers like questionnaires or breathing tests, or electrophysiological tests like an EMG that test the muscles and nerves. And what this can tell us is it can give us clues for things to help us diagnose ALS faster or follow the disease progression, so that when someone asks what stage I'm in, I can say you're in the early stage, middle stage, or late stage of the disease. It also helps to kind of characterize people who have the same diagnosis. So everybody with ALS is not the same, and that's very important. When we do clinical trials, we want to look at the same population, and so sometimes biomarkers can help us segregate populations that would respond to a particular drug. And so this is how biomarkers can really help make trials successful, but also help the drug be more effective in a certain person. Now, the pipeline itself for ALS drug development is large. And as you can see from this slide, the majority of the compounds are in phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. I won't talk too much in detail about the phase 1, phase 2 trials, although they're important. I just don't have a lot of time to cover each and every one of them in detail. I'll focus more on the phase 3 clinical studies. In phase 1, what I can say is GDC-0134 is a drug from Genentech, and it is ongoing at the current time. AT1501 is a CD40 ligand antibody, and it's being developed by Analyxis, and it's about to start. They're planning a phase 2. HERV-K suppression. So HERV-K is a retrovirus in a certain percentage of ALS patients, and if they express that particular retrovirus, they can be eligible for a trial from the NIH in Bethesda, the National Institute of Health, for antiretroviral therapy. Perampanel is a small single center study, I believe in Florida and in New York. And BIIB 100 is a small phase 1 study being conducted by Biogen. And BLZ 945 is also a small phase 1 study being conducted by Novartis. In the phase 2 category, there are multiple drugs that are recruiting, which is indicated by the star, or ongoing, which is indicated by the plus sign. The one I'll highlight is AMX0035, since there was a recent press release on results that showed a beneficial effect on ALS. In the phase 3 study, I will talk about each of the drugs that are listed in that category separately. And then in the approved therapies category, Riluzole is the FDA-approved medication for ALS, and it recently received approval in the liquid formulation. So not only can you take it as a tablet, but you can take it as a liquid. And it's been around, the tablet formulation has been around for more than 20 years. Edaravone is Radicava, and it is an intravenous medication that was recently approved also to slow down disease progression. Currently, there's an oral tablet that's being developed and is in current clinical trials, and hopefully that can, if that shows equivalence to the intravenous formulation, it can be provided for people who have hurdles in trying to get the intravenous dosing completed. And Nuedexta is a drug that was approved for easy laughing or crying, but there is a beneficial effect for patients with speaking and swallowing difficulties. Now, the first drug in clinical trials is levosimendan. Now, this is a drug from Orion Pharmaceuticals and is ongoing, so they're not enrolling any more patients in the study, and they're following these patients to the end. It should complete in mid-2020, and results should follow. This is a skeletal muscle activator. So what it does is, in the setting of reduced nerve input, which occurs in ALS, it helps to improve muscle contractility. And so you get a stronger contraction and reduced muscle fatigue. It's an oral tablet, and it's being done in an international double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trial. And its objective is to confirm the effect on respiratory function and physical function in ALS. So these were preliminary signals seen in the phase 2 study, and this phase 3 study is going to confirm it. There's over 450 patients enrolled, and the duration of the trial is 1 year. The second drug that is also in phase 3 and is ongoing, so it's fully enrolled and not in recruiting any further patients, is arimoclomol. Arimoclomol is interesting in that it induces these chaperone proteins to help clear misfolded protein aggregates that are thought to make the nerve sick or damage the motor neurons. And so this is an oral drug. It's fully enrolled again, and it has about 200 participants. The study duration is about 76 weeks, and it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center study. And we should hopefully have the study completed by the end of this year, 2020. The next drug is recruiting. So ravulizumab is a drug from Alexion, and it is a C5 inhibitor. It is a C5 inhibitor that is involved in the complement system, and abnormalities in the complement system seem to damage the motor neurons and the motor neuron function. It is an intravenous medicine, and it'll be done in a double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center study, again international, and it will involve about 350 patients, and the study duration is about a year. Now, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the study still is undergoing startup activities and initiation of sites, and so hopefully it will pick up momentum once we have some ease up of the COVID-19 pandemic. The next drug that is planning to enter phase 3 is ibutylast from Medicinova. And this is a drug that's supposed to reduce neuroinflammation from things like cytokines and interleukins. It is an oral medication, and it's planned to be a 1-year study. There was a phase 2 study that was completed and reported at the International ALS Symposium in Perth, Australia, which showed relatively good safety. And there's certain eligibility criteria. This is not all of them. They're posted on clinicaltrials.gov, but the study will be seeking people with ALS that are adults with breathing capacity, slow vital capacity greater than 70%, and symptoms less than 18 months. Masitinib is a drug from AB Science and also planning a phase 3 study. It is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, again, targeting neuroinflammation. It's an oral medication, and it'll be conducted in a double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center international study involving about 500 patients for a 1-year duration. Some of the key eligibility criteria there is also diagnosis of ALS, whether it's familial or sporadic, vital capacity greater than 60%, and this study in particular is looking for people who have a decline in the functional rating scale that's greater than 0.3 points per month. So it's a little bit tricky, but it's to look at the effect of slowing down disease progression. So moving from the phase 3 trials, I would like to talk a little bit about clinical trials targeting gene mutations in ALS. And this slide highlights several of the active clinical trials in specific gene mutations in causing ALS. ALS is caused by a number of genes, but a majority are caused by SOD1 and C9orf72. The clinical trial that's the furthest along and most mature is the SOD1 mutation clinical trial BIIB067. The name of the compound now is tofersen, and it's in phase 3 clinical trials, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But right on that heels of that trial, there's another trial that's actively in phase 1 outside of the United States, and that's AP101, which is a human monoclonal antibody to SOD1. And the other phase 1 study that's in clinical trials but not recruiting new patients is C9orf72, which is BIIB078, and I'll talk just a little bit about that as well. Now, tofersen has completed a phase 1 and phase 2 study. It was a randomized, placebo-controlled, single ascending dose or multiple ascending dose, so that's SAD and MAD is the acronym, looking at the safety, pharmacokinetics, and the pharmacodynamics, as well as some preliminary efficacy signals. Now, in this initial phase of development, Biogen looked at several different doses and presented interim analyses in May of last year at the American Academy of Neurology. In that interim analyses, it showed that the people that were dosed with the highest dose of tofersen at 100 milligrams had a lowering of the SOD protein in their spinal fluid. So usually people with SOD1 causing their ALS have elevated SOD proteins in their cerebral spinal fluid. So the orange line on the left-hand graph, figure 3, shows the people who are dosed with 100 milligrams compared to the tofersen at 20 milligrams, which is the blue line. Now, along with lowering the SOD1 protein in the spinal fluid, in that same cohort of patients, we saw a slowing of the loss of functional ability in those patients dosed with the highest dose of tofersen at 100 milligrams. So on the the right-hand graph, which is the ALS-FRS R graph, the orange line are the people that were dosed overall with tofersen 100 milligrams, and the blue solid line is the overall placebo group. And the dotted line, so the orange dotted line are the fast progressors, and the blue dotted line is the fast progressors that receive placebo. And you can see the difference in the effect is even greater in people who are fast progressors. Now, I spoke about tofersen, which is an antisense oligonucleotide, but there are multiple different technologies that can allow us to target gene mutations in ALS. So Biogen has developed the antisense oligonucleotide targeting SOD1. They've also developed an antisense oligonucleotide targeting C9orf72, which is in phase 1. There is also, as I mentioned before, an active clinical trial from ALS Pharma using AP101, which is a human monoclonal antibody. But there are other technologies that are in development in the lab using adenoviral vectors, so using viral vectors as a delivery mechanism for genetic material. And so it is hopeful for specific genes that cause ALS that we would be able to find a meaningful therapy in the future. Now, the next types of trials that I wanted to discuss was clinical trials using cell therapy. And I intentionally use the word cell therapy because there's different types of cells that we can investigate in ALS. And cell therapy can be any type of cell, but sometimes it's confused with stem cells in particular. And I'll talk a little bit about stem cells trials in particular. So I put here a list of clinical trials that are using cell therapy approaches. And so the first one is actively recruiting people with ALS. So this is using T regulatory cells. So T regulatory cells are part of a family of cells called T cells, which are lymphocytes, and they're part of your immune system. There's data to show that ALS patients have lower levels of functioning T regulatory cells. And so the process is to take cells from a person living with ALS, expanding them into functional T regulatory cells, and then infusing them back into the same person. So that's autologous infusion. There are some approaches being developed, not yet in clinical trials, for allogenic transplant of T regulatory cells. So that's coming from a different person or a naive cells and then infusing it in a different person. There are some studies that are using progenitor cells. So these are cells that are descendants of stem cells, and they don't reproduce infinitely, and they don't have the capability. They have a little bit more restricted capability of what types of cells they can turn into. So NeuralStem is a completed study. Q-cell study is one that is planned to be initiated using human glial progenitor cells. And the one CNS10 NPC GDNF, lots of letters, but that's human neural progenitor cells plus these growth factors that are transplanted into the spinal cord, and I'll talk a little bit about those. And then, of course, there's mesenchymal stem cells, which there's a couple of studies that I'd like to talk about going forward. So the first one is autologous mesenchymal stem cells. So these are cells that come from yourself and then are cultured and expanded and then put back into the body. So mesenchymal stem cells have a lot of properties that make it attractive to use in ALS. So as I mentioned in the first slide, there are many different mechanisms that we know are not working properly in the motor neuron. And so that includes inflammation, um, apoptosis or programmed cell death. And so there are many mechanisms where mesenchymal stem cells can be beneficial. Now, the first study I'll talk about is the neurone study, which uses autologous mesenchymal stem cells that are engineered to secrete growth factors, and that's from Brainstorm. So the process is that the bone marrow is harvested and mesenchymal stem cells are isolated from the person. And then they're expanded outside of the body. And as they're engineered to secrete growth factors. And then once the cells are ready, they are then transplanted through a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture into the spinal fluid. And so initially, phase 1 and 2 studies were done in very small subset of patients in Israel at Hadassah. And stem cells, mesenchymal stem cells, were given either intramuscularly or intrathecally, which is the process of putting cells into the spinal fluid through a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. And from there, it was moved to a phase 2A small study to do intrathecal delivery. And in those patients that were treated, there was a beneficial effect on forced vital capacity, FVC, and ALS functional rating scale. Now, this was an open label study, meaning the patients knew they were getting treated, the investigator or the physician giving the cells knew they were being treated. And so it needed a more rigorous study to confirm the findings in this small phase 2. So a phase 2 study was completed where 48 people living with ALS were enrolled in the study, and they were randomized either to receive mesenchymal stem cells or placebo. And the safety was very good. So there was no deaths or treatment-related serious adverse events and no dropouts. Patients only received 1 injection in this phase 2 study. And preliminary efficacy was evaluated looking at breathing, which is slow vital capacity, or SVC, and ALS functional rating scale. The side effects that were experienced were mostly related to the lumbar puncture, and most of the common side effects or adverse events, AEs, were transient and mild and moderate in severity. What was notable about this study was that in the spinal fluid, there were markers of neuroinflammation. So that's the markers that are listed on this slide: CRP, MCP1, STF, MIP. And if you look at them in patients that were treated with neurone versus placebo, you could see that there's a difference between the pre and post-transplantation levels. So the top set of graphs are the patients that were treated with neurone, and the bottom set of graphs are the patients that were on placebo. And the blue bar is pre-transplant or before they received treatment, and the green bars are after. And so this showed that there was an effect on the markers of neuroinflammation and needs to be confirmed in a phase 3 trial. This study and its results were published in Neurology in 2019, this past December. And so there was a little bit of confusion as to what study this was referring to, but that publication refers to the phase 2. The phase 3 study is ongoing. So the phase 3 trial design included people that were under the age of 60 with a breathing capacity over 65% and disease less than 2 years. They were randomized either to receive autologous mesenchymal stem cells, MSC, with neurotrophic factors, or placebo. And so it's fully enrolled, it's ongoing, and hopefully the study will complete this year and results will be forthcoming. Now, another type, as I mentioned before, is human-derived neural progenitor cells. This is an interesting study out of Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. Essentially, the researchers there were able to provide a clinical grade line of human stem cells that were generated and engineered to release GDNF, glial-derived neurotrophic factor. And the study not only looked at a new line of cells to give to patients, but they also developed an innovative way, a surgical technique, to implant into the spinal cord. And specifically in this study, they implanted these cells into the lumbar or the lower part of the spinal cord. They treated 18 patients, and they're continuing to follow those patients and collect the data. and hopefully in the next couple of months, we should hear more details about the safety, tolerability, and any preliminary signals. Now, I talked about the brainstorm study, which is autologous mesenchymal stem cell from the bone marrow, but there is another study that is developed by the Mayo Clinic in Rochester using mesenchymal stem cells derived from fat tissue or adipose tissue. And so the researchers at Mayo Clinic Rochester did a lab-based experiment, animal-based experiment, looking at autologous adipose-derived mesenchymal stem cells. So stem cells derived from fat cells that were injected into the central nervous system. And it showed fairly good safety, and it provided some evidence to move into a human clinical trial. And so the process for this particular study is taking fat tissue from the abdomen and culturing those cells and expanding and isolating the mesenchymal stem cells. From there, the cells are expanded and then delivered to the patient through a spinal tap, again, intrathecal administration. And from there, it's hoped that these stem cells would secrete growth factors that would be very protective for the motor neurons. And so in this phase 1 study, and I have to thank Dr. Nathan's staff from the Mayo Clinic, who was willing to share the data and the update for the study. It was published in Neurology. 27 patients were treated. There was a fair mix of male and female patients, and also a fair mix of people with different symptoms as their initial symptoms. So some people with spinal onset, which means arm or leg weakness, or bulbar onset, speaking or swallowing difficulty. At about 3 weeks after being treated with these particular mesenchymal stem cells, an MRI was performed, and there was an interesting finding where lumbosacral nerve roots were enlarged, and there was a little bit of nodular enhancement. So that's where the blue arrows are on the screen. And despite the findings on MRI, there was tissue that was evaluated in 4 patients, and there was no evidence of a tumor formation. There was no evidence of inflammation or around the area of the spinal cord or arachnoiditis. There was enough safety information to move to a phase 2 trial, and so this is the current phase 2 trial from the Mayo Clinic. So it is planning to enroll a larger number of patients, 60 patients in total, and will include multiple Mayo Clinics across the country. So it includes Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, Mayo Clinic in Florida, and Mayo Clinic in Arizona. And in this study, patients will receive 4 treatments separated by 3 months each. And so the primary endpoint, again, is to look at the safety of repeated intrathecal administration of these mesenchymal stem cells that are derived from the adipose tissue or the fat tissue. And of course, everybody will be treated with cells, and so it's open label, and they will be compared against a control group that's derived from a database. And then the Mayo Clinic group has done a fantastic job of collaborating with multiple experts across the field to look at different markers and genetics and inflammatory markers, both in the CSF and in the blood. The current status for this study is that they have 11 patients enrolled in Mayo Clinic in Rochester. They have 2 enrolled in Mayo, Florida. And it's hoped that Mayo Clinic in Arizona will begin enrollment in the summer of 2020 as well. The enrollment will be in a rolling manner, but currently there's been some holdup of the enrollment due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that actually is an important topic and relevant to ALS clinical trials. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening with ALS clinical trials and research in the current state of coronavirus and COVID-19. So right now, what I want to emphasize is that despite some of the hurdles that are being posed to ALS research, there's still a lot of activity that's ongoing. So many labs across the country are having virtual meetings and virtual conferences to share findings. Certainly, data entry and analysis still continues, and many people are taking big data approaches. So one of those big data repositories like Answer ALS has just shared access to do further research on the data that was collected despite all of the COVID-19 pandemic situation that's going on. Many groups have been writing grants and developing new ideas, working with companies to develop new compounds into and enter into ALS clinical trials. And many sites, despite limited activity at the centers themselves, are still doing the trainings, still doing the contracts and budgets and study startup for being ready when the situation allows for it to conduct and continue clinical trials. Updates have been provided to the ALS community through the Northeastern ALS Consortium. I'm the co-chair of the Northeastern ALS Consortium, and we provide educational webinars. So the link is there for any updates on COVID-19 and its effects on ALS research. Observational studies are studies that look at biomarkers. So we talked about that earlier. And currently, these studies are minimized at several institutions. Ongoing study visits are generally on hold if it's an in-person visit, but if it's a visit that can be conducted remotely, those continue. New participant enrollment in existing studies are generally on hold, but there's a lot of regional variability depending on when the surge of coronavirus and COVID-19 affects a particular place. But many remote studies and digital or home-based studies continue regardless. And analysis of existing data still continues or even has picked up pace because of the clinical activities that have been reduced at the centers. Now, there are some things that cannot be done at home. So hospital-based therapy that includes things that are administered through intravenous or intrathecal administration has to be done at a center. For intravenous or IV administration, there have been many sponsors and clinics that have used the option of home infusion to continue those clinical trials. And a majority of centers have been able to continue with intrathecal administration. So the stem cell studies and the gene therapy studies in ALS use intrathecal administration, and many have been able to continue on a limited basis. So that means you can bring the patient in and maybe it's an abbreviated visit, doing follow-up visits or safety visits at home and doing it remotely by phone. Some centers during a peak surge may have to delay these visits or stop entirely until there's better safety for patients to come to a center or the staff to come to the center. Another major issue in ALS clinical trials is vital capacity testing. And so in testing vital capacity, person takes a deep breath and exhales. And because COVID-19 and coronavirus is a respiratory illness that's highly transmissible, this kind of testing can pose a risk not only to the person living with ALS, because the machine is shared between patients, but also to research staff. And the other issue is the conservation of personal protective equipment. So there are ways that we could do home testing in clinical trials that are being explored, and also alternative measures. Now, trials that are awaiting IRB ethics review, certainly in New York City, when we hit our peak surge, we had a slight delay in reviewing new protocols or new trials and new research in the IRB. But after coming over that hump and hitting a plateau and decreasing caseloads of COVID-19, certainly there's been an increased rate of review of new trials and also review of documents related to study startup. So I think it's just a temporary pause or delay, and it would continue. Now, same is true for new trials with IRB or ethics approval. So these are trials that were approved and ready to go, but there was some restriction on enrolling new participants. Sometimes it's related to the fact that enrolling those new participants involve measuring a vital capacity, which we can't do at certain institutions. Sometimes it is just being held because the caseload of COVID-19 and coronavirus is too high, and it would pose increased risks to people living with ALS or to the research staff. But this has allowed centers and academic institutions to look at ways to do enrollment virtually by remote consent or virtual visits. Now, I wanted to provide an update on two particular trials that have had to be nimble in the setting of COVID-19. So the Healy ALS platform trials is a trial that's set to initiate now. And there's a lot of activities that have continued despite the COVID-19 pandemic. So study startup, trainings, and meetings have already occurred. Updates have occurred to the patient community and to the ALS community. And so I am highlighting a few of the compounds that have been selected to go into the platform trials. This has also been shared through the Neil's educational webinars and updates. So the first 3 drugs that are ready to go in the platform trial is zilucoplan from Raw Pharma. Again, this is a complement C5 inhibitor, much like ravulizumab that I talked about a little bit earlier. Again, the abnormalities in complement have been described in ALS, and this can damage the junction between the muscles and nerves. It also affects the cells in the brain as well. The second compound is verdiperstat, which is a myeloperoxidase inhibitor from Biohaven, and this also blocks neuroinflammation. And then the last one, the third one that's ready to go is CNM-AU8, which is gold nanocrystals from Clean Nanomedicine. And this has an ability to have antioxidant properties. And so these are the ones that are ready to go, but close behind are pridopidine, which is a sigma-1 receptor agonist, and IC14 from Implicit. And so these are the compounds that are entering clinical trials, and the centers that are participating have experienced some temporary disruption of normal workflow. And of course, there's regional variability about which centers are ready to start and ready to enroll, but it will depend, again, a lot on the surges of coronavirus in particular regions. Many of the visits that are scheduled within the trial have been evaluated for possible flexibility for conducting them at home because travel can be limited in certain areas. Additionally, we have evaluated virtual visits, local home collection, shipping of drug supply, possibly including collection of outcome measures that can be done at home, which could prevent people from having to come to the center, and alternative respiratory measures if the in-clinic vital capacity testing is very limited. The updates for the Healy ALS platform can be found at any of these websites, including the Neil's website, ALS Association, and also the Healy Center. Now, the other trial that has demonstrated some flexibility and adaptation to the COVID-19 situation is sodium phenylbutyrate and TUDCA, also known as AMX0035. This was one of the drugs that was in the phase 2 column, and it has an ability to protect against oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction. And so the study was conducted. It included 137 patients randomized to either the study medication or placebo. And then once patients finished the study, they had the option to enroll into the open label extension, OLE. This is an extension where after they've participated in the main study, they have access to the actual study drug. And what happened is that majority of patients were in the open label extension when the COVID-19 pandemic began in the United States. And so in March 23rd, a memo was distributed to all the sites to allow flexibility for visits to occur remotely. But in a week, the protocol was then revised and submitted for approval. And once it was submitted for approval by April 13th, a memo was distributed to allow for direct-to-patient shipping, reduced frequency of safety labs, and removing some of the additional breathing tests so that visits can continue, and provide written communication to the patient. So this allows continuation of access to drug despite the coronavirus outbreak. And still, many people within the study are working on procedures for collecting safety labs, vital signs, electrocardiograms, and providing home health services. So this is all happening in real time right now, May 2020. So I've covered the late phase clinical trials, reviewed the therapeutic targets and pipeline as a big picture. I've talked about genetic trials. I've talked about trials using cell therapy. And last, I wanted to provide an update on pre-approval access. So this is access to experimental medications that has no FDA approval in the United States. And so it can get a little bit confusing because people often confuse terms, but the formal term or for the mechanism by which someone can access investigational therapy through the FDA is called expanded access. It's sometimes also referred to as compassionate use, and it's a pathway to allow people to get access to investigational drugs or biologics or medical devices. Right to Try is federal legislation that allows terminally ill patients to obtain investigational therapies that are in active development and completed phase 1. It has no FDA oversight. The traditional way most people get access to investigational drugs is through a clinical trial. So eligible patients who fit the criteria to enroll into a study enroll and either get treated with the experimental or investigational drug or placebo. And the main goal is to evaluate the effect of that investigational drug in a particular population. Once that study is completed, then there's an option for some studies that will go into what's called an extension phase or an open label extension. So commonly, after participating in the main part of a clinical trial, usually patients then have an option to roll over to an open label extension where they're offered the investigational drug. And open label means that they know they're getting drug, the physician and investigator knows that they're getting drug, and the manufacturer knows that they're getting drug. Now, expanded access. Expanded access, sometimes people use the term treatment use or compassionate use. It's regulated by the FDA. And there are some criteria for patients to be eligible to use that program. But the goal is not to obtain information about safety and efficacy of that particular investigational drug or experimental drug. And there's different ways by which someone can get access. So if there's one individual with a serious life-threatening condition, they go to their physician, they can make a request from the FDA and the drug manufacturer, and that's called an individual patient or single patient emergency IND. Now, if there's a group of patients that are requesting, you can anywhere from 15 to 20 patients or more. This can be an intermediate size patient population IND. So one IND or request will cover a number of patients. And then there's a third mechanism, which is a treatment protocol. So this is for a widespread use or a large population of patients. Typically, manufacturers or drug companies hold a treatment protocol IND, and it's a companion protocol to the main study that they may be conducting. The requirements for all expanded access programs or EAPs is that the patient has a serious or immediately life-threatening disease or condition, and there's no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy. Potential patients' benefit justifies the potential risk, and that's assessed by the physician caring for them and providing the drug. And then there is a criteria that's also there that says providing drug through expanded use will not interfere with the initiation, conduct, or completion of clinical investigations that could support marketing approval. So essentially focusing on the fact that people who are making the request are not eligible for the main clinical trial and they have no other option to access that particular medicine. So there are some limitations to the expanded access programs. So manufacturers may decline requests, and it could be for a variety of reasons that they may not disclose. But often there could be a limited drug supply, or it may affect clinical trial recruitment, or the company may be so small that they don't have the administrative capability to maintain oversight of an expanded access program, or they're afraid of a liability risk. And the FDA can't require a manufacturer to provide the investigational drug. Physicians have to determine that probable risk from drug is not greater than probable risk of disease. And physicians who are in an organization or a hospital system are governed by that institution or organization. And so they may not always be aligned with the physician's interest. And of course, cost is not necessarily covered by insurers. And so that's another limitation to expanded access. Now, many have perceived challenges in implementing expanded access programs. So there have been issues with the application being difficult, lengthy, requiring increased effort. And the FDA has made an effort to revise the forms to make them more streamlined and easier to use. And the application process has been perceived to be slow, and therefore these challenges seem to pose barriers to individual access to investigational therapy. despite that perception, the FDA has this publicly available data on their website where they show expanded access requests, and blue are the expanded access requests that were allowed to proceed. And the red is the expanded access protocols that were not allowed to proceed. So majority of the time, FDA usually gives approval for proceeding with an expanded access application. But because of these perceived challenges, there was a push for legislation, which became law, which is called the Right to Try law. Now, in this legislation, a patient is eligible if they're diagnosed with life-threatening disease or a condition, and they've exhausted approved treatment options and are unable to participate in a clinical trial involving the eligible investigational drug. And what's an investigational drug that's eligible? Well, that drug has to have completed phase 1 clinical trial testing. So there's some safety information available. And it has to be in active development. So under the Right to Try law, you can't just request any drug. The other issue is that although FDA oversight has been removed in this Right to Try mechanism, still the sponsor of that request, so the physician or the drug company, has to submit an annual safety summary, including any known serious adverse events. And any clinical outcomes from someone that obtains the right investigational drug through Right to Try can't be used against the investigational product to evaluate its safety or efficacy. Now, the law has limitations. So it does not make it necessary for the drug manufacturers to provide that investigational drug, even though the patient is eligible and the drug is eligible for request. It doesn't require manufacturers to cover the cost associated with the use of that eligible investigational drug. And it certainly doesn't require insurers to pay for that treatment either. And unlike the expanded access program, so FDA, there's no application to the FDA, it also doesn't require IRB approval. So usually if you require expanded access, once the FDA says, okay, a submission has to be made to your local ethics committee, and then once that's approved, then only can you provide the investigational drug. So this is just a table to put side by side the two mechanisms to access drugs before approval from the FDA. And you can see that there are some limitations to both expanded access program and Right to Try. So I hope that this provided some overview and updates to the current clinical trial landscape in ALS, and also to terminology, including phases of development, cell therapy, genetic therapy, and also expanded access. There's a lot going on, and it's likely that whatever I say now in May of 2020 will be outdated in a couple of months. So you can find out more about clinical trials. This is the NEALS website at neals.org to do a clinical trial search. The main hub for clinical trial postings is clinicaltrials.gov, which can be a little daunting because there's a lot of information about all the diseases. And you have to provide key words to do a very good search. The ALS Association and the Muscular Dystrophy Association also have abilities to provide updates on clinical trials in ALS. But it's important to stay in touch with your local physician and your local clinic and ask the questions when you hear about them for any updates in clinical trials. With that, I'll leave it with a very important message that May is ALS Awareness Month, and just like you, I hope to see a world one day where ALS doesn't exist. Thank you very much.